Welcome to ZKast, everyone. I'm Zscaler from ZK Research, and I'm joined today by Deepak Patel, who is the IIoT guru for Zscaler. And Deepak, before I introduce you, though, I do want to just give a quick shout out to eWeek. eWeek's my media partner. All ZKasts are done in conjunction with the eWeek He Speaks program. So Deepak, I gave you kind of a cool title there, guru of IIoT. Why don't you just do a quick intro on yourself and tell us what you do at Zscaler?
Great. I joined Zscaler, and my main initiative here is to take all the goodness that Zscaler has done for users and workloads and bring it into the operational technology and the Internet of Things landscape. I have about 20 plus years of experience in data security, network security, web application security, and all of that. And we're effectively looking at this space and seeing how do we help solve the problems for them versus trying to take an IT security product and say, okay, it's ready for the OT market.
Okay, and is this something, so IT and OT and IT-OT conversions and convergence has been talked about for a long time. Are you starting to see, and historically they've not really converged, right? The OT, yep. Projects were run by OT and IoT by IT, but are you starting to see some coming together of that?
Absolutely. So we see a market shift, I would say, that's happening in the last year. And I got to hand it to some of these cyber attacks, like the ones that happened at Colonial Pipeline, or if you go back to 2017, the NotPetya ransomware pretty much took down a lot of the manufacturing companies and transportation logistics companies that were not kind of looking at it from that perspective as to cyber attacks can be disruptive to their operational side of the business.
And what's been driving the coming together of these two industries? Because like I said, it's something we've been talking about for a while. It's not really happened. I know personally, I'm getting more questions from IT pros about operational technology. I know as people return to work, there's some smart building things going on, but I'm sure it's broader than that. So I'd like to get your take on that.
There's multiple drivers for it. One is the business itself has to evolve. Like if you look at what Amazon has done in retail, if you're not going to digitize your business, there's a whole concept around what they call as digitalization. It's simply put, digitalization is taking a physical process and making it digitized, whereas digitization is just taking your data. So there's a big difference between a physical process and data. There's business drivers too, but obviously you can't ignore the COVID factor. So when you look at what's happening in the space, previously when something broke on a manufacturing floor, you would just fly in that person. That's no longer the point anymore. So now they see that having somebody remotely look into it is both from a time perspective, shorter time to recovery, as well as from a cost perspective, because the same expert could be now looking at multiple locations. But the big shift has happened because they see that cybersecurity risk is actually impacting their viability. You can see that if a power company is hit by cybersecurity attacks and they're down, if they were not supported by the government, they would be out of business very quickly.
Yeah, it's interesting how connected everything has become a thing. I was talking to this company down in actually they're in Costa Rica. They make cookies, and the way they have this machine that does a bunch of stuff and as part of the process. And the way they tested the oil before was they'd actually pull some oil out, send it to the US for testing. Then they get it back and it would tell them whether they need to be changed or not. But that whole process could take like a month sometimes. Now they just have sensors in them and they're able to tell to the second when that happens. And so if, local cookie factories, I guess, are now going to, in Costa Rica, are going to connect to everything, then more and more businesses will. Now, I do find whenever you talk about technology trend, the security of stuff tends to lag the deployment of stuff by a while. And it's like we have to deploy it and get breached a couple of times before we realize, we better secure it. And I think I'm starting to see a similar trend in both IoT and OT. And so what are some of the factors that are making customers more aware of the need to secure, or what's driving that security in this area?
So they all recognize it. It's not a problem that's lost on them. They see that these devices are years or decades old compared to your typical IT equipment. But at the same time, you can't just take your latest patch and update them. That is where a lot of the companies, when they look at it and say, you can't take the IT playbook into the device landscape. So the approach to that market has been primarily around isolation. How do we provide isolated kind of an access into these OT systems, or how do we allow these IoT devices to communicate to the internet, but not really bring the problems back to them? So the focus is more on what the industry calls as macro segmentation versus the typical, the IT world is now evolved towards user identity to application segmentation, or it's another form of micro segmentation when you look at it. But the OT landscape is different. Like what applies to a user cannot really just be applied to a device.
Yeah, and I know that you go to some factories and hospitals and things, and some of they're running like Windows 95 and things like that.
Yeah.
Some of the older operating systems, and some devices, they don't. With an IT devices, you can put agents on them. You can't put agents on other ones. But more than that, what are so as companies look to secure their things environment, if you include IoT and OT, what are some of the challenges they're facing in doing that? Right. I know, you talked about the old devices and things like that, but what other issues arise here?
The first challenge is you cannot deploy anything on these devices, right?
Yeah.
The second challenge is you go to a factory floor. I'll give you an example. We're working with an auto manufacturer. They have a plant in Kentucky. A minute of downtime costs them $150,000. So to install anything at all, to make any network changes or any changes to that environment, you need planned downtime. There is no planned downtime because somebody has to write the check for, you need it down for 5 minutes. That's more than $500,000 that can knock down. So actually, a lot of the IT leaders don't recognize that fact. And I asked them, it's like, okay, you want to go and deploy this network solution there. Have you figured out what's the planned downtime that you have in place? And usually the answer comes out to no. And when you ask the factories, it's like you get 15 minutes of downtime and they want to get their nuts and bolts fixed, not some IT security put in place. So to sum it up, it's usually downtime. But the second biggest challenge happens to be you cannot install anything on these devices.
Yeah, and I think just there's just an overall complexity level of having to bring these environments together on this too. So I think the thing that you said that's probably the most important for the audience to understand is you cannot apply IT security principles to OT environments. You think you can because they're just connected devices, but they're a different class of devices, right? So
yeah. There's a classic example on the internet, like somebody applied a Windows patch to what is called as a HMI or a controller that was controlling an oven. And the next thing you know, they lost control of the oven, and whatever was in the oven was completely fried and the oven caught fire because whatever Windows update they applied was not compatible with the controller software that's there. And after that point onwards, it's game over for that. So for those kind of reasons, the security updates that are also critical cannot be applied to these devices. So that's why we focus heavily on not deploying anything on that. But at the same time, how do we provide access to these systems or these systems to connect to the internet without really connecting them to that network? That's where zero trust is becoming kind of very much relevant to this space.
Yeah, before we get into zero trust, I did want to ask about the risk level here too. You talked about the downtime, but it's more than that, right? Like if an OT device is breached, and we've seen some examples of this historically, it actually can create a backdoor into the IT network, correct? And so the risk of being breached here is bigger than just that OT device being taken offline. It could actually have pretty big consequences to the business, correct?
Yeah. I'll give you an example of what a mining CISO just told me. It's like they can accept a breach into their IT environment, they'll lose some data and whatnot. But in the mining environment, it's loss of life and limb and equipment. So you may get fired, but here, if there's a breach and something happens, it's not just getting fired, you've actually cost somebody's life. So the level of responsibility is vastly different. So a lot of our customers are not as worried about data breaches, but they're quite worried about the impact to the business that comes from it.
Yeah, I've heard of that even in construction sites that use autonomous vehicles now and things like that, because they have proximity sensors and things to tell them when to stop. And you scared me. So now
just one additional thought to that. So what we are seeing as a trend is they're now recognizing in the OT or the device landscape that there needs to be a separation between what we call as a control network that is very latency sensitive, and usually the protocols are not secure to be transported over the internet. And there's a management network where an operator or somebody is making major changes to it. If you're able to just separate the two out, you're like 90% there.
Yeah. Now you had mentioned zero trust. So I want to pivot back to that. And I know Zscaler has been one of the leaders in zero trust, if not, the leader in evangelizing it. How do you take some of the principles that you've created with zero trust and then apply that to IoT and OT environments? Because they are, as you said, quite different.
If you look at the fundamentals of zero trust, it relies on the fact that any entity, whether it's a user or a device, to connect to an application, whatever it is, it has to go through serious kind of validation. You have to verify identity. Then we have to make sure that the device posture is known and the user's posture is known. Then we look at the threat level as to, is this user or somebody coming from a managed versus an unmanaged device? At the end of the day, when you look at it, zero trust is about connecting an entity to another entity without connecting the networks. And if you look at the OT landscape, majority of the threats are because you established an information highway by connecting the two networks together. A lot of manufacturers that I work with, they have site-to-site VPNs with their vendors. So imagine if one vendor is infected, it's like a free flow of ransomware through and throughout. So when you think about zero trust, we're making sure that you can connect a user remotely to an OT system to do troubleshooting and maintenance. You connect two sites together using zero trust connectivity, but you're not connecting a network. I think that's the fundamental application in this space is preventing two entities from just being connected with each other and not having that business policy being applied to that.
Yeah, in fact, it's interesting you say that from the partner standpoint or the vendor standpoint. That's actually a bigger issue that I think people don't really realize about. In fact, there was I think it was 2014, 2015. There was very well-known retailer, right, that was breached, and their point of sale system was breached. But that breach actually occurred on their HVAC contractor,
right?
And that created a backdoor. And if they had been running zero trust, that point of sale system or network would have been completely invisible to the HVAC network, and really nothing would have happened. Correct?
Yeah, because in zero trust, it's all about containment. So you're going to contain that lateral threat movement. And even if that HVAC vendor would have been breached, they wouldn't have been able to laterally move from that to the point of sale system.
Yeah. And I guess that's the risk, when you live in a world where everything's connected, you can do a lot of really cool things. But I guess it does, exponentially, grow that attack surface. So now one of the things you had mentioned was you can't put agents on the things.
Right.
And I think we're all used to doing that in IT, right? Whatever PCs, whatever, even printers and things. So how do you help your customers address that challenge? If you can't put agents on them, what do you do?
So that's why we talk a lot about the north-south controls, right? So if you take a factory as an example, there's usually a network on the factory side. I talked about the management and control network. There's a control network, which is in the Purdue model. It's called anything below level 3 or below. I don't have to go too much into the technology piece of it, but think of everything, including the IT equipment that's used to run the factory floor. That doesn't have to be connected to the internet in its entirety. So what you're doing is you're identifying, does a technician need to connect it? Does a user need to connect to that factory floor? If the factory floor is reaching out to the internet for updates, it's fairly straightforward to figure that out. If it's trying to dump data into AWS or Azure or whatever it is to do some kind of data analytics, or it's not as complicated as the IT landscape. Me as a user, I go to many different places, but in the device landscape, it's fairly straightforward. What we have seen is it's mostly inertia that, hey, if you do this thing, something will break. So once you're able to show them that the separation of management and control, wherein the whole thing, the factory can operate without being connected to the internet, is what they're looking for. It just comes down to, we're not going to put agents. You're not going to change the network, which is a big deal for them. And on top of that, you're not restricting them from doing their day-to-day operations once they're on separating that physical security and the cybersecurity part helps them quite a bit.
Yeah. Now you had also mentioned segmentation, and segmentation is widely deployed in corporate networks. And so, what role does segmentation play in IT and OT environments? And you talk about how customers can use that to their advantage here.
Yeah, I'll give you a few examples. So we have a few customers that have taken microsegmentation into the OT side of the floor. And long and behold, within days of deploying that, a rogue role here or there actually stopped production. So the next thing the OT guys did was removed everything. And from there on, there's no segmentation, there's none of those things. That's the problem, right? So if you're a user, you're willing to put up with, let's say, 30, 40 minutes of downtime because it's not affecting you as much. When you get to the factory floor, that same concept kind of fails. So that's why when we talk about segmentation in the factory floor, we talk about it in the macro sense. Take one production line, take like the submarine approach, separate that production line up. So you segment it. But within that production line, you're not doing a lot of east-west rules. As soon as you introduce dynamic policy changes or dynamic firewall rule changes, you kind of lost the OT folks on it. They're like, what? You want to make changes on a daily basis? For them, change is the monster that they don't want to deal with. They are gold on production lines have to run continuously, and that's what they're gold on. So it kind of goes counter to the microsegmentation dynamism.
So your recommendation is stay at the coarse grain level, but once you get down to micro, even I suppose even with microsegmentation, if you could set it up initially once, right? As soon as you make any changes at all, then you get like it just becomes overwhelmingly difficult, correct? Like
correct.
Yeah.
At that point, you're just doing macro segmentation. The whole point of microsegmentation is there's too much dynamism in your environment that you need to account for. These environments are not that dynamic. So if you take that playbook, for a device, it may be different. If you're talking about connected cars, yes, you can do certain things with it, but there you're starting greenfield. So you can actually do things there that you can't do in the factory floor. I think that's something that the industry needs to understand as to, you can take an IT security approach that works for the financial sector into, let's say, another sector, but it's not the same thing with the OT landscape. There's specific verticals that have their needs. Like pharma is different than mining. Mining is different than, let's say, consumer packaged and goods. So understanding those nuances is important.
Yeah, and I think you've done a nice job sort of sprinkling examples, but can you go through some other use cases you're seeing, for this type of security?
Definitely. We are working with a top oil and gas company where in the oil and gas industry, everybody kind of outsources from everybody. So what happens is they're creating enclaves. In our case, our customer is actually creating an enclave in every oil rig that's out there in the world. So what happens when they want to create that enclave? The natural thinking is, hey, I need a VPN and a firewall, the firewall to protect that enclave and a VPN to remotely access it. The complexity increases significantly as soon as you say, I want to do this for 1,000 oil rigs, right? So that's where we're looking at it and say, how do we simplify this? How do we make sure that even if we deploy a solution there, there's not a lot of firewall ports that need to be opened up? How do we prevent all of these things? So we have deployed a solution there where third parties can access these oil rigs, again, through an isolated mechanism using RDP, SSH, or whatever console protocols. But a technician can get native TCP UDP access. And all of this is happening without the end customer having to say, let me open up a firewall port for you right now. So eliminating those, we're working directly with the business side of saying, what's your source of friction? Is it because it's open to the internet? Is it because somebody has to make changes to it? We're bringing a lot of those workflows into our product line. So that way, somebody that's not IT and security savvy can still achieve the connectivity in a secure manner without getting hindered by IT and security.
So you have simplified secure remote access, which can be difficult in some cases, but then also be able to add in the privileged remote access for all your partners and third parties, but not giving them the keys to the kingdom, right? So they have
absolutely. Yeah. And to add another layer to this, it's all working over satellite links. So we've also optimized our delivery, our product delivery for satellite links. And that actually helps us because if you look at it, we are a geo-distributed cloud. We have over 150 data centers. So when that oil rigs are not physically, they're just maintained there by a complex set of equipment. So when the oil rig moves around, there's nothing to do. It'll just connect to the closest Zscaler data center there is.
Yeah, I guess that's the benefit of being cloud native. So you can literally connect to anything anywhere as long as it's just connectivity link. So
Think about it this way. When you talk about defense in depth, if you're talking about 10 years ago, you would talk about a stack of appliances that had to go wherever you had to protect it. Now that's all sitting in the cloud. So it also achieves a very small, nimble footprint without having to do much there. It's all going to be done in the cloud.
Yeah. Now, I know you also have a partnership with Siemens, right? And they're obviously one of the biggest companies in the world when it comes to operational technology. So can you tell me about the partnership? Why it's beneficial for Zscaler and for Siemens, but also, and this is maybe the most important aspect, how it benefits customers.
Yeah, it all started with Siemens is a pioneering enterprise. For a company that's about 400,000 people, they took an early bet on Zscaler when Zscaler was a small company. So Siemens and Zscaler go quite back in time when Siemens trusted Zscaler can deliver this kind of cloud delivered security for both their users. What happened is when the Siemens lab technicians saw the benefits of what they were seeing for accessing their own equipment, they saw that they're having difficulty connecting to Siemens equipment running in all these auto manufacturers. So for them, the biggest advantage is they can connect to their own systems without the same friction that they're running into today. The other advantage for Siemens is they're also going through what all can you digitize?
Yeah.
When you're trying to do that and you're trying to do that at scale, security becomes one of the key factors that they have to address. Their customers ask them when they want to do the connectivity as to, is this solution certified from a FedRAMP perspective, from different certifications? So the benefit for Siemens is they're a great industrial automation vendor, but they're not a security vendor. So for them to go and achieve that connectivity, it becomes a lot easier for them to say, we have a joint solution that we work with Zscaler. Once you deploy this, you will get all the check marks possible from a security certification perspective. It's kind of a win-win for everybody involved because the customer now doesn't have to deal with, and Siemens technician wants to come in, let me open up a firewall portfolio. Or there's the element of risk is gone from Siemens, from the customer perspective, and it facilitates a faster business for everybody involved here.
Yeah, it's interesting that Siemens has digitized almost everything in their portfolio, and they're making them connected. And I think one of the interesting things about connected factory equipment, connected cars, things like that, is that for the first time ever, companies like Siemens can actually bring new features to finished products while they're in production, right? Right. Historically, that wasn't the case. You would have to roll out new boards, new hardware, things like that. And so the connected capability allows them to, like I said, innovate with the finished product, which is really something that, through the company's history has not been able to do. So that's pretty fascinating. So,
yeah. So there's a great use case that we are working with a retailer actually. So they have, if you look at retail logistics today, all the distribution warehouses, they're all robotics. So when the robots have to connect to the internet, they go through Zscaler. So that way, all that retail logistics equipment is kind of hidden from the internet. On the flip side of it, when they have to call in a technician, they don't have to do anything at all. The technician is just provide a URL and they come to it and they get kind of an ephemeral identity and things just work for them. So it's about making sure that we're part of their business. So the joint partner with Siemens helps us become a part of someone's business, whether it's Siemens, whether it's our customers. Whereas the traditional Zscaler products, we are helping them immensely, but we're not a part of their business. We're effectively a tool that their employees use to increase productivity.
All right. So Deepak, I just have one last question for you. If I'm an IT person, and there's a lot of, most of my viewership is IT pros, and I've been given the responsibility of securing our OT environment, just give me a couple of best practices, things they should follow, or things at least they should think about as they start planning their security for this area.
Start with the goals. If you look at the OT personas, their goal is plant and people safety. They're looking at how do they keep the production or increase the production. So don't walk in with your IT playbook, understand the goals from the other side, and then you can have a conversation about if you're using this VPNs, yes, it's fast and it's frictionless for your users, maybe not, but it also means that you may not be able to meet your goals of plant and people safety. So having that conversation that way versus walking in and saying, ransom is going to come and hit you and we are at risk, you have to flip the conversation to have a more business-oriented talk and understanding their risk and then talking about it. Do not take the IT playbook. Do not talk about, let me patch your systems, and that is not going to fly well. If you walk in with a ServiceNow, let me integrate with ServiceNow and get your identity, you've already lost them.
Yeah. I chuckle at that because years and years ago, before I was an analyst, I was actually an IT pro. And I remember just when I took over for a relatively small company, I took over facilities and telecom. And I remember walking in my IT playbook, and that didn't work at all. So that's great advice, though. So I'm glad you brought that up. So anyways, Deepak, thanks for joining me today. That was outstanding. And so always great to talk to a thought leader like yourself about this area. And I think for those of you watching, I know this concept of OT and IT integration has been on the horizon for a while, but from everyone I've talked to, I do believe it's real. So on behalf of Deepak Patel from Zscaler, I'm Zeus Caravala. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time on another ZKast.